We're about to begin. Welcome to our webinar, The Life and Work of Monica Sjöö. The personal is political is spiritual. And this event is part of the Being Human Festival. Today is the last day of the festival, which has been running across the UK, mainly online, since the 12th of November. Being Human is a national festival of the humanities run by the School of Advanced Studies, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Its purpose is to disseminate humanities research. The Monica Sjöö Curatorial Collective is delighted to be taking part in the festival, which showcases and promotes humanities research. And this webinar has been generously supported by the Visual Culture Research Group of the University of the West of England, Bristol. My name is Jo Elliott, and I coordinate the collective, a group of artists, academics, art historians, curators, and friends of Monica Sjöö. We came together for the first time only in January this year, January 2020. And our shared vision is to celebrate and explore the significance of Monica Sjöö as a leading feminist artist, activist, writer, and goddess theorist. This is the first of a number of events that we plan to host. Monica's work is being revisited by a new generation of researchers and curators, two of whom we're delighted to be hearing from today. And there are currently several national and international exhibitions of Monica's work under discussion. All contributors to this webinar are members of the Monica Sjöö Curatorial Collective. I'm speaking to you from Portugal. One of our readers is in Sweden, and the others are in Bristol, Birmingham, and London. The wonders of Zoom. And on the chat before we started, I see we've got quite a few people today watching us from the United States. So that's very exciting too, because Monica, as those people know, did a lot of work in America. And after we've heard from our three speakers, we will have a question and answer session. So please post your questions in the chat. And if it is to one of the speakers, a specific speaker, please will you say so. So some of you will be very familiar with Monica's work and perhaps watched the Jane Jackson 1977 film on our Eventbrite page. Perhaps you've been following us on Instagram. But for those of you who are not familiar with her work, and as a reminder of her impact, Tate will contextualize the work, our first speaker. Dr. Tate is an art historian and visual research fellow at the University of the West of England. Her research and teaching focuses on women artists, their trials and tribulations, successes and contributions to the history of art. She's a trustee of the Feminist Archive South, part of the Special Collections Library at the University of Bristol, that holds a large amount of Monica's work, and they've been very supportive of our Monica Sjöö project. So over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Jo. Just get my PowerPoint up. Okay, thank you. Monica Sjöö was a Swedish artist who spent most of her adult life in Bristol, or the southwest of the UK. She was truly prolific, so I hope I'm going to be able to do her justice in this short presentation. Marianna, our Swedish member of the collective, has kindly agreed to be Monica's voice as we go along. Monica was a feminist, a peace activist, a goddess scholar. She was a tall, imposing figure, and although softly spoken, she had presence and charisma. She was certainly uncompromising, and I think some people found her intimidating, but her friend Maggie Parks remembers her also as having a great sense of fun and of joy. She was linked into the most amazing network of individuals. She corresponded with Judy Chicago. Alice Walker bought her paintings and had her to stay when she was in the States. and also organizations, anarchist, socialist, feminist, pagan, literary, artistic. And she was constantly traveling, meeting with people, exhibiting, lecturing, and also, of course, communing with sacred sites when she wasn't politically demonstrating, and also making art. Her most best known work is God Giving Birth, 1968. It's now an icon of feminist art history, appearing in all the standard texts and books. It was inspired by a really intense and positive experience of the home birth of her son, Toivo. And it was an experience that she found she couldn't reconcile with society's stereotype of women as weak and uncreative. So what we see here is an austere and strong woman of colour who dominates a 6-foot work of art. She's straddling the cosmos. A baby's head is emerging from her vulva. And Monica chose quite deliberately the word God for the title, not goddess, because she said she wanted it to represent, quotes, the creative power, and to attack the absurd myth that the creative force is male and phallic. It was first shown at the Guildhall in St Ives for their part of their annual arts festival in 1971, and it caused a furore. The mayor attacked it. It was taken down by the police and city councillors, and it was accused of being blasphemous and obscene. As Monica reflected later,
apparently, birth is obscene and disgusting in our society. It's a taboo subject in art.
And indeed, when the work was shown again in 1973 in Swiss Cottage Library in London, it caused a similar fuss. The pornography squad of Scotland Yard and the public prosecutor both investigated. The work was had to be defended from attacks. There were headlines in national and local press. And for 2 weeks, the threat of destruction of the art and court proceedings against Monica for obscenity and blasphemy, obscenity and blasphemy hung over Monica's head. And actually, it does seem extraordinary to me that within my living memory, at least, you could have such a strong response to this painting, a painting like this. And of course, the degree to which it did rock the patriarchal institutions, I think, is symptomatic of the state for women at the beginning of the 70s. There was a need for a second wave of feminism, and Monica was at the forefront. She was born in Sweden in 1938 to artists. Her mother brought her up as a sole parent. She left home very young and was soon involved with left-wing and anarchist groups in Stockholm. She was making and exhibiting raw declamatory works like this piece, Patriarchal Man, and where we see he is stomping on the sexualized, objectified imagery of women. She brought a Marxist understanding of the suppression of women, driven by land ownership, power, the structures of capitalism. But she was really critical of the masculinism, the sheer sexism of a lot of the left-wing movement. As she wrote in 1972,
since I consider that the only true revolution will come about when the silent mass of women finally rise, I will not join a left-wing group, but work with women in the women's liberation movement.
In a very intense period of activism and a constant flurry of meetings from the late 60s, Monica helped to found the Bristol Liberation Movement group. She was involved in the Bristol Women's Centre, which was the very first one in the UK. She worked for unsupported women in the Claimants Union, Wages for Housework, the Gay Women's Group, as well as being a founder in the UK of feminist art and goddess movements. So throughout her life, she marched, she demonstrated against the Vietnam and Iraq wars, at Greenham Common, before the altar at Bristol Cathedral, and many, many more. And always her visual artwork was completely integrated with this campaigning, reaching across many different media. She produced paintings, posters, banners, book covers, illustrations, and she made no distinction between fine art and design and other pieces which were perhaps seen as just sort of pragmatic information sharing, because, as she, in her own words, she was totally committed to socially involved art. And we can see it in works like this: Backstreet Abortion, Women Seeking Freedom from Oppression. Some of the text makes demands in writing: no more enforced motherhood, free contraception, abortion, our own decision, and dignified childbirth. And we can perhaps compare it to this poster, gone too far, which obviously in a very different style and appealing to a different audience for a different reason. So, and we see it again in pieces like a poster like this. Again, that kind of audience is a real call to arms. Women's liberation is coming to Hartcliffe. Or the cover of Peace News, where she integrates some of her fine artwork into a graphic design for a magazine. Other work is, has an international commitment to anti-racism and a global understanding of women's experience. For example, this work, Past and Present, 1969. But here we can see how imagery that she developed in a painting is then used directly in a banner that she took on an anti-nuclear march to the RAF base at Bawdrey in Pembrokeshire in 1982. No distinction between high, low art. Other screen printed posters reiterated this international commitment. So support national liberation fronts, women have nothing to lose with their chains, woman worker, farmer, potter, and so on. Yet other posters, screen prints, celebrated sexuality and lesbian love or sisterhood. Here we got Angela Davis and Janis Joplin. And interestingly, both of these were originally paintings, which she just took the imagery directly into a screen print so that it could reach a wider audience, be more accessible and affordable. The posters were fly posted. They were taken to meetings, exhibitions, conferences, and so on. Partly they were to get support for campaigns, but they were also sold, and many others I can't show you here. They were sold to raise funds for the movement. Now, threaded throughout this down-to-earth kind of campaigning activism was her relationship to and research into matrilineal and goddess cultures, cultures that have been swept away by patriarchy, by the patriarchal religions, social and economic structures, including those, of course, of capitalism. These cultures fundamentally informed her struggle to find a visual language to express women's experience through her own eyes, as she put it, which she wrote about most cogently in a pamphlet called Towards a Revolutionary Feminist Art. In it, she explained,
"Why I find this still of importance for us today is since the great goddess was the projection of a community who were not sexually repressed and economically dominated. She can give us a clue to what women are like before they came to conceive of themselves and define themselves through male eyes. She is a projection of a type of woman that is banished with the destruction of matriarchal civilizations."
many paintings explore the goddess tradition and evoke this belief. An early one, Cosmos Within Her, 1971, is more simplified, more stylized perhaps than many of her works, but very dynamic. Diana, Moon Goddess, is part of her written intention to express the strength and potency of women using archaic imagery. In 1978, she experienced a mystical experience at Avebury. She took magic mushrooms and found herself completely involved with the standing stones and on Silbury Hill. as a result of which she painted this work, The Goddess at Avebury in Silbury, 1978. And the same year, she painted Sheila Nagig, Creation, 1978. Now, a Sheila Nagig is a pagan prototype of a pagan image of a woman holding open her vulva. And interestingly, they appear all over Europe, kind of slipped surreptitiously into the carved decoration of churches. This particular one is taken, I'm pretty sure her painting is based on this one, which is in the church in St Mary and St David, Kilpeck, Herefordshire, which you can visit. I did the other day. And I think it's fascinating to see her drawing on this range of local imagery. But her scholarly research into goddess cultures was really profound and very wide-reaching. She published many articles and pamphlets, and her magnus opus was probably The Great Cosmic Mother, still in print, which she wrote with Barbara Moore, and it was published in 1987. Many more paintings and other work explored and celebrated the goddess, often drawing on a range of cultures and eras. Writing in 2004, she reflected,
I had a sense, though, that ancient women were communicating with me and through me. Without this sense of being one in a long line of women, active and surviving through the millennia, I would have probably gone out of my mind with anger and loneliness, as well as grief at what we women of today have lost.
And certainly Monica herself suffered great loss and grief and sorrow. 2 of her sons predeceased her. She also felt grief at the horrors of war, which I think is expressed beautifully, and she wrote about it later in this painting. She made it in response partly to the death of one of her sons, but also to the Iraq War, when she was going on demonstrations, she said sometimes daily, and it was a way to cope with her grief. Ishat Inanna is a Mesopotamian goddess, and of course Iraq is the present day geographical location of Mesopotamia. She also felt a really kind of embodied, I think, sense of the increasing degradation and damage to Mother Earth. Mother Earth, this work, we must take care of her. And her eco-feminism became ever more pronounced in her work. On the summit of Silbury Hill in 1978, she had felt
overtaken by a sudden and enormous grief, grieving at our loss of woman cultures, the pollution and death of her land all around us. What have they done to you, Mother? What have they done? What have they done?
And in 1996, Monica painted Earth Mother in Pain. It's based on a Neolithic sculpture and was painted in response to visiting the Newbury eco-warrior camp, where they were defending trees from the encroachments of a bypass, and also in response to a terrible oil slick from a tanker that had grounded off the Pembrokeshire coast, one of her favourite landscapes. And she then took this painting on a demonstration at the gates of Bristol University Research Station at Long Ashton, where genetically modified wheat, funded of course by the giant multinational Monsanto, was being experimentally grown. In conclusion, I've chosen these images to remind us both of the colourfulness of Monica's work and the scale, just how big it is. And I think these are things that can sometimes be overlooked in the images that are available online. In her uncompromising life and work, politics, art, campaigning activism, feminism, personal life experience, and a deep involvement with goddess cultures were all inextricably linked. And while she did identify closely with a deeper female culture and spirituality, she refused to retreat from the immediate feminist project, acting on the present, working towards a better future. And although she died in 2005, it is this interweaving, I think, of activism, art and scholarship that makes her so fascinating and so relevant to our current times today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you so much. You've given us a really broad picture and a really good understanding of Monica's work. And I would just reiterate the enormous size of many of her paintings. And as some of you will know, she nearly always lived in very small places. And those of you perhaps who watched the film on Eventbrite would see her and her boys doing the washing up enormous pictures propped against the wall. So Monica was not daunted by her environment in expressing what she wanted to. Right, thank you so much, Sue. And now I would like to welcome Ruth Lindley. Ruth completed her PhD at the University of Birmingham in 2019. Her thesis uses the goddess movement to open up histories of gender, secularism, and religious change in post-1960s Britain. Indeed, I think you had a case study chapter on Monica, didn't you, Ruth?
Yeah, that's right. I think you couldn't have written a thesis on the goddess movement without making Monica like a central part of that. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Lovely. So I'd like to ask you some questions. First of all, how did you first discover Monica's work?
Thanks, Joe. And let me just try and share my screen. Otherwise, I'll trail off if I try and, there we go, start talking without having done that. Yeah, and thank you so much to everybody who's decided to join us this afternoon. I'm really blown away by the fact that you're with us from all over the world. That's so impressive. So yeah, let me jump straight in then. So to answer your question, Joe, how did I first discover Monica's work? I think what I need to do is talk about the development of my PhD research on the goddess movement a little bit more broadly to get there. So I'm a historian and I did my research in the history department at the University of Birmingham. And my project used the goddess movement as a case study in order to hone in on and also unpick some of the problems in the twin stories that historians tell about religious change and feminist politics in modern Britain, the combined effects of which have essentially written out women who attested to any kind of strong feminist faith after the 1960s, be they kind of goddessy or within more institutional religious traditions. So first off then, what do I mean when I say the goddess movement? This is a label that I've used to describe the political and spiritual activities of feminist women in Britain since 1975, and within which, of course, Monica Sjöö was so deeply embedded. The first goddess group in Britain I've identified as the Matriarchy Study Group, which was a product of the London Women's Liberation Workshop. It was founded by 1970s feminist activists, including the Jewish feminist theologian Asphodel Long, who wanted to do research into the pre-Judeo-Christian past. So looking back to the Neolithic, for example, which they believe was women-led. Their activities were largely cerebral. They were interested in developing programs of research, talks, workshops, and writing that aimed to restore women's knowledge of their divine past. However, they were also responsible for early forms of ritual and spiritual practice that echoed the shape of the Celtic revival. As spiritual feminism moved into the 1980s, it was galvanized by the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common, where experimentation with ritual was allowed to inform direct action there. The rising popularity of goddess feminism in this period led to the establishment of matriarchy study groups in all other parts of the country. And in 1981, an organization called the Matriarchy Research and Reclaim Network was founded to look after them all. So then during the early 1990s, when the peace camp at Greenham was fading, but the threat of war remained, a renewed grassroots feminist spirituality movement emerged that centred on the East Midlands-based scene From the Flames. And that was co-edited by two Greenham women, Maggie Parks and Fron McIntyre. At a similar time as this, Cathy Jones was working in Glastonbury, where she organised the first Goddess Conference in 1996, and where there's been a Goddess Conference ever since. And Monica Sjöö is absolutely everywhere present in this story of the goddess movement. She's a unique figure in the British goddess movement in that way, because her goddess feminism predated the Matriarchy Study Group and even the beginning of the broader women's movement in this country, as the form of the goddess movement changed as it interacted with Greenham Common in the 1980s, Sjöö provided continuity between earlier matriarchal research and a new generation who came to the goddess through Greenham Common. And of course, by the 1990s and 2000s, she was internationally known as a key figure in the transatlantic movement. And I think some of you might be maybe cross at me when I say this, but although the links between politics and feminism and spirituality were absolutely foundational to the goddess movement and repeatedly reinstated by Sjöö and its other adherents, my own preconceptions of the movement were limited when I started the project. Even though I was familiar with the political writing of American goddess women like Starhawk and the theologian Carol P. Christ, I'd seen no evidence that women in Britain shared these views. And in fact, it was my belief that women who used the goddess as a tool for feminist analysis were in a small minority in a larger apolitical movement. So I was a really long way off from Sjöö when I started this project. My failure to see the goddess movement as an inherently political entity was shaped by historical literature that was available to me on post-1960s Britain. So the dominant history of feminism assumes the secularism of feminist politics, especially in relation to the second wave. And then if you turn to the histories of religion to look for the goddess movement, you find that it's dealt with exclusively by sociologists of alternative spiritualities or the so-called New Age, who often take for granted the male-dominated institutions of alternative spirituality. So, you know, the Pagan Federation, kind of take that for granted as the center of the New Age, and at the same time systematically omit feminist perspectives from their analysis. So in these kinds of accounts, the goddess's genealogy is traced back to distinctly non-political sources, like you know, the anthropologist Gerald Gardner's version of Wicca in the 1950s, or they depict feminist spirituality as the kind of like cranky wing, you know, an offshoot of the broader pagan movement, or they describe the goddess as nothing more than a therapeutic figure for women, so a post-feminist idol. So because of that, the politics of the goddess movement didn't figure at all in the early stages of my research. I was interested at the beginning in interviewing women whose spiritual practices focused on or related to the goddess, so that I could use their testimonies to challenge the reductive ways that sociologists had written about women's spirituality. And because Glastonbury is home to the most visible and well-known community of goddess adherents in Britain, that's where I started. I reached out to the founder of the movement, Cathy Jones, who I didn't interview myself, but she was kind enough to pass on my request to several women who were involved in the Glastonbury movement. I conducted 11 interviews in the end, and they just completely broke open my understanding of the goddess movement and its embedded history in feminist activism. Two participants in particular were absolutely uncompromising about the place of the goddess within feminist ideas. And when I asked these women to describe their spiritual journeys to me, both completely unprompted wove together these stories of spiritual and political development in which they located their goddess spirituality within the key texts of the women's liberation movement in the 1970s and also at Greenham Common. And I'll just read you exactly what one participant said to me. Oh, I've gone a little bit too far. Because what she said was a little bit of a wow moment. So she said to me, people who say goddess is nothing to do with feminism, well, I don't know where they've been for the last 50 years, but not on the same planet as me. And those interviews gave me a starting point then with which to write the goddess movement back into our histories of feminism. Because my interview participants had emphasised Greenham Common as a formative moment for the goddess, I went to archives where source material on Greenham is kept. And you should be able to see on the screen now, it was kind of in those archives that I had a moment of radical unlearning where suddenly this secular seeming cultural production from Greenham, so newsletters and songbooks and chain letters, drawings, appeared differently, revealing consistent and sustained engagement with the goddess's activism. I saw photographs, and you can see one here, of makeshift goddess figurines guarding campfires, read the prophetic writing of protesters who were using ritual and magic in direct action, looked at illustrations of enchanted creatures like snakes and spiders and witches tearing down the fences of the military base. And really from that moment on, it seemed like the goddess was everywhere. in every archive that you traditionally look for source material on post-1960s British feminism, there she was, completely embedded in the print culture of mainstream feminism. And these are all archives that historians, you know, would normally go to explain the women's movement, and, you know, they've kind of missed out on the goddess. So because Goddess feminists were just as keen to maintain a record of their political activities as their secular sisters, the best known feminist archives in Britain hold almost full runs of matriarchy network publications. These include, you can see on the screen here, the Matriarchy Study Group's 3 pamphlets, as well as, moving a little bit later on, the Matriarchy Reclaim and Research Network's newsletter, its irregular journal Arachne, and the 1990s zine From the Flames. So I feel like that was like the longest winded way ever to say that it took me a really long time to get to Sjöö, and there are reasons for that. I first encountered her in her amazing archive, which is currently held at Feminist Archives South at the University of Bristol. And when I did finally encounter her there, her papers provided the framework within which to place all of these tantalizing hints of the goddess in interview testimonies and, you know, in women's lib magazines. And I just wanted to tell you that story because I wanted to show that I think for many of you it's a given that Sjöö was a feminist, but she really doesn't occupy a straightforward place in the history of feminism. The fact that I had to uncover her or even learn how to see her political spirituality at all speaks to this bigger question about why some individuals and groups get taken seriously on their own terms, while other groups are relegated to the invisible fringe. And that's a historical and political question, and one that came to be at the centre of my thesis. Thanks, Jo. Sorry for the long answer to that one.
Really, really interesting. You've opened that up for us beautifully. And also one of the things you've done is remind us, just as Sue did, is how incredibly dense Monica's thought and work was. I wonder if I could ask you a supplementary question, which is, what for you strikes a particular personal chord in all that you were discovering?
Yeah, I think, kind of for full disclosure, maybe I should say a little bit about my own spiritual and political commitments. Like Monica Wood and the Women of the Goddess movement, I would say that I'm a feminist. And while I don't have faith, so while I'm not a goddess practitioner, I also don't believe that there's such a thing as a uniformly, secular state of mind, or even an entirely secular society. So because of that, I'm really sympathetic to Sjöö and the goddess movement and religious expressions of feminist politics more broadly, although maybe not always convinced by their methods and approaches. But nevertheless, my project was it was less about intervening in the feminist theory, if that makes sense, and more to do with thinking through how Sjöö disrupts what we think we know about post-1960s feminism and women's experiences of religion as well. And that's really at the heart, I think, of my interest in Sjöö. I said to you, didn't I, that I use Sjöö as a case study in the thesis, partly because she was such a key figure in the goddess movement, and also because she's one of the very few goddess feminists who archived a substantial collection of her own papers, which are all available for researchers to use at the University of Bristol. So it's a really important collection, and it's absolutely vast. It's made up of 8 huge bankers boxes, and I think those of you who knew Monica won't be surprised by that. She was a collector of materials, reading materials, and was very generous and shared them with her friends as well. And interestingly, I think this is kind of useful to think about. Despite Sjöö's really strongly held view that she repeated many times over, that there can be no spirituality without politics and no politics without spirituality, it was a shock to discover that in her archive, spirituality and politics are in fact physically separated. So materials on feminist politics are kept in a couple of bankers boxes, and materials on spirituality are kept in 2 completely separate bankers boxes. And I bring that up, it's not an oversight on the part of the Feminist Archive South where her papers are held. It's more of an issue of kind of lack of funding rather than a misunderstanding of Sjöö's politics. Sjöö was actually archiving her papers at a time when spiritual feminists were imagining new ways of preserving the information that they were uncovering about women's sacred history. And Jean Freer, that you can see on your screen now, she was one such woman And she played a central role in establishing what is now known as the Feminist Archive South, or FAS, at Bristol. She belonged to the same Southwest women's group as novelist Faye Weldon, who's often credited with founding the archive. And Faye was an American expat who'd explored spiritual feminism in a separatist Wiccan coven with Susanne of Budapest in the mid-1970s. And during the 1980s, she and volunteers at the archive worked on devising a new classification system that reflected, or that better reflected, the meta-narrative of matriarchal history. So a kind of matriarchal organization of knowledge rather than a patriarchal. However, long story short, really, lack of funding, the fact that the archive had a charity status and kind of moved in and out of universities over the years, meant that this radical spiritual feminist vision of cataloguing was lost. So by the time Zhu Sun Toivo dropped off the last of Monica's papers at Feminist Archive South in 2005, after her death, it was down to volunteer archivist Liz Bird to catalogue them. And it was her feeling that the papers looked jumbled when they arrived. And she offered to give shape and meaning to what she perceived to be an incoherent collection of papers. She took them home, spread them out on her attic floor, and began organising. And her categorisation of Monica's papers, which has remained kind of largely unchanged to this day, reflect her own understanding of feminist and left-wing politics, which foregrounded the secular over the spiritual. So there's an organisation in Monica's archive that actually contradicts the way that she viewed her own life and politics. Sue so wonderfully talked about the way that, you know, Monica didn't distinguish between the politics, the feminism, the painting, the anthropology, the research, the spiritual practice. However, you get this situation where contained within the spirituality boxes in Monica's archive is various literature from the goddess movement that Monica viewed as central to her political imaginary. And they include the matriarchy network publications like Goddess Shrew, you know, materials from the international goddess movement, also some newsletters and magazines that Liz Bird interpreted as pagan and therefore apolitical, but which actually had inherently political aims, such as Pipes of Pan and Wood and Water. On the other hand, while the spirituality boxes contain a kind of disorientating collection of goddess and pagan literature, the boxes on feminist politics support a more recognisable and secular form of the feminist second wave. And they include often cited sources from the women's liberation movement, including documents relating to the first conference at Ruskin College in 1970, as well as specific campaigns as well. So all of this just means that historians, the way that they engage with Monica's archive has been pre-disciplined. The archive allows certain claims or certain kinds of histories that align with the common sense of feminist history and support a secular logic of history writing. So I just kind of wanted to give you a taste of that case study because it highlights my main interest in Zhu, which is that we can use her presence to rethink spirituality in contemporary Britain. And this idea that historians are committed to, you know, like a secular idea of modernity seems less to do with set of arguments about the past and more to do with what they think counts or doesn't count as history.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And people who are sort of on the edge, somehow always marginalized, where it doesn't fit comfortably, then they're pushed to the margins, which I think is an issue. I was actually a trustee of the Feminist Archive in the 1980s, and I well remember the discussions about trying to have a different way of cataloguing, which of course never really got anywhere because it was such a difficult discussion. Anyway, that was lovely. Thank you, darling. Oh, thank you, Ruth. And could you tell me what you personally think is Monica's relevance today? Because there's a lot of interest in her today.
Yeah, definitely. I'll fly through this because I feel like I've been talking for a really long time. But when I first interviewed women about their goddess spirituality back in early 2016, some of the women that I spoke to felt that they needed to be maybe a little bit secretive about their spirituality. And that's not all of them, just some of them. But I remember at least a couple of women who were worried about colleagues discovering their spiritual practices, and they felt like they kind of had to live double lives. One of my participants said that she was in the broom closet, not really having shared, you know, her goddess practices with friends and even some of her close family. And I think that feeling that she had to be in the broom closet is kind of symptomatic of the way that women's spirituality has been characterized in academia, and that this has had a direct impact on how the popular press deals with women's spirituality as well. I just wanted to share this article. It's an old one, but it's such a good example, I think, of what I mean. This is a Daily Mail journalist. So, you know, she went to the Glastonbury Goddess Conference in, I think it's 2006. And I mean, you can just see how shaming the title of the article is. The journalist here emphasizes the narcissism of women who do spirituality, and, you know, even kind of relates it to this kind of rampant consumerism that women have been picking and choosing new beliefs. So, you know, when you've got this in the press, why on earth would you be open about your spirituality? However, since I conducted those interviews, I think the landscape has changed. The political upheavals of, you know, kind of mid-2016 onwards, so the referendum on the EU, the election of Donald Trump, I think has led to a resurgence in spiritual feminist activism at grassroots and in political institutions as well. I think this is a particularly striking image. So you might remember this happening. This was September last year, and to announce the Supreme Court's ruling that Boris Johnson had illegally suspended Parliament. This is Lady Brenda Hale, the first female president of the Supreme Court, and you can see she's wearing this just strikingly realistic and like shockingly large Sprider brooch on her right shoulder. And recognising, I think, the brooch as a provocative symbol, the press and the Twitter sphere speculated about its meaning, and a lot of the times, whether they knew it or not, invoking an older brand of spiritual feminist politics in their interpretations. And you can see here the New York Times headline reads, "The brooch that ate Brexit." And if you're familiar with, you know, Monica's theology or theology, then you might liken this vision to her vision of the great spider goddess who had the power to entrap and consume patriarchal magic. In that same article, journalist Lou Stoppard really drives the metaphor home, arguing that Lady Hale, who's dressed all in black here in her historic announcement, brought big witch energy to disrupt the patriarchal political establishment, using the witch as a symbol of female subversive powers. And I think Sjöö is so relevant today because none of this means that, you know, academics or the popular press have started to take the varieties of women's religious experience seriously. But I think if we can just recover and start to celebrate Sjöö's spiritual politics, then women's spirituality just can't be called apolitical, save by those who view it through an androcentric lens. Historicising the goddess movement and taking seriously the intentions of women like Sjöö can go some way to contesting the presumption that the goddess is nothing more than a post-feminist narcissistic idol. I think I'll maybe just finish by saying that I'm really proud to be part of the Monica Sjöö curatorial collective that's seeking not only to reinstate Sjöö, but I think also is kind of allowing us to explore and open up the possibilities for different kinds of political engagement in the present as well. So yeah, thanks, Sjöö.
Oh, and we're so pleased that you're part of the collective, and that's a fantastic final image. There's been a little things a bit coming up on the chat about the pronunciation of Monica's name. Marianna, could you say it for us, please?
Yes, of course. Monica Sjöö, if you say it in Swedish. Monica Sjöö, Sjöö. You have to rehearse that, I think.
Yes, I'm laughing because when Marianna said that to us for the first time, we were all really taken aback. We thought we'd been very clever saying shoo. Just once more, please, Marianna.
Monica Sjöö, Sjöö.
Now, I'm not going to say all together now because I think it's time to move on to our next speaker. So thank you again, Ruth. That was really, really interesting. And I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of people will want to get back to you. I'm now going to turn to Kavita Maya of University College London. We're delighted, Kavita is also a member of the collective, and we're delighted she's with us today. Her research and writings center on the sociology of race, gender, and religion, especially feminist spiritualities, on women of color, on anti-racist and decolonial feminist theorizing, and on creative and critical readings of webs of inequality and power. So welcome, Kavita. It's marvelous you're with us. And I'd like to ask you the same broad questions that I asked Ruth. So to begin with, how did you discover Monica's work? What led you to Monika?
Thanks very much for the introduction, Jo. So in answer to your question, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So I first discovered Monica's work way back 11 years ago, actually, when I was enrolled in a gender studies master's program. And I became very interested in the idea that women's spirituality and the goddess movement could be taken seriously as a topic of research, because I had initially assumed that it was just too out there to be even looked at through an academic lens. And in my gender studies course, I was being introduced to amazing bodies of scholarship on feminist theory, gender theory, and queer theory, and anti-racist feminisms, and Black feminist ideas. But I was really curious about how there was no focus really on religion or spirituality. So gender studies as a discipline has developed along very secular lines, as Ruth was saying. And sort of women's spirituality was referenced mostly in books in the university library that I read on gender and religion, which is actually, I later learned, a subfield of the discipline of theology and religious studies. So like gender studies as a secular discipline has kind of developed along a very different trajectory from sort of studies of women's spirituality, which are more kind of sociology of religion, critical theories of religion, etc. And so I want to kind of bring these two disciplines together and do interdisciplinary research on the goddess movement. And this was where I first discovered Monica's work. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to pronounce her surname perfectly. It's Monica Sjöö. Is that right?
We'll do our best.
So her great cosmic mother was the one that I read first. And this is really her kind of magnum opus that was developed alongside Barbara Moore as her co-author, but it was based on her 1975 pamphlet of the same name. And I'm sure many in the audience are familiar, but just in case for those who aren't. So this is a book that kind of introduces the concept of a global prehistoric matriarchal religion or culture that spanned the globe. And it takes a very universalizing, sweeping look at the idea that there was a global goddess religion. And this is Monica Sjöö's and Barbara Moore's answer to the question of how did we get here in terms of patriarchy? Like, why are patriarchal norms so dominant? Why do we live in a patriarchal culture? And they answer this question by directing the gaze towards the prehistoric past and creating or producing this narrative that sweeps across different cultures and contexts and presents the idea of the great cosmic mother. And it's a really fascinating book, and I think it's very emotionally appealing. And I was very kind of personally struck by it when I first read it. But I'm also going to try and complicate the narrative that it's, that of its kind of feminist politics in a way, because it also takes a very universalist gaze towards the past that I think it's inherited from colonial narratives via theosophy in 18th and 19th century thought. So that's one of the ways that I discovered Monica's work. And the other was when I was preparing to do doctoral research, I was very, very curious about the goddess community in Glastonbury. And when I was preparing my research plans, I was spending time there. And Monica's work was everywhere. I mean, again, just in case there are some people in the audience who don't know, Glastonbury is a site of a contemporary institutionalized form of goddess religion, where there is a goddess temple that's the registered place of worship. And Monica's ideas are very popular there, and her artwork is on the walls of the goddess hall and the goddess temple. But at the same time, I had the sense that Monica was a very kind of political and activist, feminist and spiritual woman, but I wasn't necessarily seeing the kinds of activism that she wrote about present in the communities that I was spending time in London and Glastonbury. And I was really interested in kind of making these links and how did the goddess community come to develop? What was its history? How had Monica's ideas influenced it? How had her paintings come to be present in the goddess hall? And how did she bring feminism and spirituality together? So I wanted to kind of piece this history that seemed to be missing. The other thing was I kind of became very aware of her artwork because of the popularity of representations of prehistory in various strands of paganism, and that are also present in Monica's work through her depictions of the sacred landscape, as in this example here. And because I was beginning to study ideas from post-colonial and anti-racist scholarship, I was intrigued and in some ways troubled by the idea that the kind of depictions of sacred prehistory in these paintings construct a very particular nativist sense of identity and belonging, or ideas about identity and belonging. And I want to look at that from an anti-racist perspective, because I think it's also important to note that although in Monica's work, like feminism and spirituality and the goddess are all very linked, for most of its history, the goddess movement has been a very white movement. So I mean, these were all like the questions I had about the goddess movement, and this is really how I first became aware of her work.
Mm. Mm. So yes, I understand. What then for you struck a particular personal chord out of all these things you were uncovering?
So, I mean, personally and intellectually, I think what's really interesting about Monica is that she is a great way to think about all the strengths and limitations and the possibilities and the problematics of the goddess movement and its history and how it's developed, and also the concept of feminist spirituality and what it can be and what perhaps it needs to do differently or to kind of reflect on. So I mean, there are two aspects of Monica that really interest me, actually. So the first one is the fact that she is, you know, again, takes very political orientation to spirituality. And it's this idea that her understanding of feminist spirituality refutes the idea of spirituality as something that can transcend inequalities and material and political struggle. And as you can see here, this is so as part of my fieldwork, as well as doing interviews and ethnography and spending time in the Glastonbury Goddess community and its network, I went to the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths, which has an archived collection of Monica's work that she archived there herself, actually. And this is Women Are the Real Left from 1979. And some of my fieldwork participants talked about how this pamphlet could be found in various feminist bookshops in London and in different cities in the UK. And this was one of the ways that women first encountered Monica's work, actually. So she was very active in sort of socialist feminist movement and in the matriarchy study group. And Women Are the Real Left is like a collection of essays that brings together her ideas about matriarchy and her kind of feminist intervention into what she saw as patriarchal socialism. So I was very interested in her activist commitments and her political orientation to spirituality, but also I still am, and I was then very fascinated by her engagements with race and racism and her depiction of Indian and African deities, and the fact that she engages with the topic of racism in a movement that is so white and one that tends to, I think, evade the questions of, you know, racism and colonial histories. So I will talk a little bit more about both of these things, I think. So this is a post of, this is a copy of the Goddess Reawakening program from 1989. And one of my research students, I think, very aptly described Monica as the great spider of the goddess movement, because she was such a prolific networker as well as an artist and a writer. So I know, as Ruth was saying, like everywhere you go in the goddess movement's history, there is Monica. She is the kind of like a very strong link between the political and the spiritual side of the goddess movement. And she understood these things in conjunction. So she was involved in Greenham Common, in the protests there, in anti-war protests. She was involved in feminist conferences organised by the Greater London Council, and in this exhibition in 1989, which was also attended by Alice Walker and her daughter. And at one point, at least, Alice Walker and Monica Sjöö was friends, and Alice Walker was inspired by her book that she co-authored with Barbara Moore, The Great Cosmic Mother. So Monica was like this, the great spider who kind of networked, who was a central node in the goddess movement's network in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And she's remembered as someone who was very unafraid of conflict, aggression. As Sue was saying in her presentation, she could be difficult. She was very charismatic, but also very forceful. She didn't shy away from arguments about politics and social issues. And in her work, I mean, this is very tied to the idea of the dark and the light. So in New Age and Armageddon, what she's doing there is taking the idea of New Age spirituality, which in her view was about patriarchal ideas about light and transcendence, and placing the mind over the body. And in opposition to that, she argued that the way to a feminist revolution was to reclaim the goddess as kind of primordial dark mother. And she often calls the goddess the dark light mother in reference to ideas about life and death, and the dark and light side of life and of spirituality. So the dark light mother is a huge theme of her work that I want to pick up on. And here we have an image of Silbury Hill and You Can't Kill the Spirit, lyrics to the protest song at Greenham Common. This is again from the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths, and an article where Monica talks about her bisexual identity and relationships and her early life. And I think this image shows Monica age 37. So this is a quote that I think really encapsulates how Monica understood spirituality and politics together. She writes, "The most insidious of the New Age ideas is the one that claims you create your own reality. You, yourself, in isolation from oppressive realities. From this, it follows that if you choose to believe that I am no longer oppressed as a woman, black, gay, etc., then that oppression is suddenly gone. This is blatantly untrue, since eliminating oppression cannot be brought about without collective and organized struggle." And I really like the last bit there, collective and organized struggle. It really shows that Monica was aware of the importance of political realities, and she was very much opposed to the idea of New Age transcendence, of darkness, of difficulty, of the messiness, and of structural inequalities in social and political life. And the other thing I wanted to mention was, so some of the research participants that I spoke to kind of attribute shows, well, I'm pronouncing her name wrong again, I'm so sorry. I'll say Monica's, it's easier. Monica's emphasis on dark and light was kind of attributed to her personal tragedies. I think Sue mentioned this, like she lost a son in a road accident, her mixed race son in 1985. And then in 1987, her eldest son, Sean, passed away from cancer. And he had been involved in the rebirthing movement. And the rebirthing movement had encouraged him to kind of see processing childhood traumas and the spiritual healing as the way to overcome his cancer. And after his death, I think Monica was very angry about this. And she kind of links this to her criticism of New Age spirituality. And she's very much against this idea that we can kind of control the body through the mind, and of kind of disrespecting the body's own material reality and the reality of the cycles of life and death. But I also think there's more to it than that. I mean, there was this personal element to her criticism of what she saw as a New Age. But it's also, you know, the personal is political. She also had a very strong intellectual and politically, socially focused critique of it. And now what's really interesting to me is her engagements with race and racism. She links the dark light mother explicitly and not implicitly to race. So in some goddess feminist work, there is an emphasis on dark and light, and you can kind of see underlying racial connotations, but it's never explicit. In Monica's work, it is explicit. And here we have a painting of the Dahomean goddess Mawu, which Monica subtitles African Mother of Us All, from 1990. And she was an advocate of the idea that all of humanity shared a common African female ancestor, which is also an idea that I found to be quite popular among goddess feminists. And it's quite interesting in that, so Monica was kind of taking this idea that was directly opposed to kind of post-Enlightenment race science thinkers, where sort of whiteness and light was considered the pinnacle of European civilization and technological and scientific development, whereas darkness and blackness, racialized blackness, was seen as something primitive and primordial and associated with mankind's kind of atavistic, inferior, prehistoric phase. And it's kind of a reversal of this idea. So in claiming Mawu as the kind of dark mother, she's linking blackness and darkness to a kind of reclaiming of sexuality and unconscious knowledge and repressed prehistory via this concept of the ancient prehistoric goddess matriarchy. And I think what's really interesting is that Monica's activism and her kind of network of friendships Like, although the goddess movement has been a very white movement for most of its history, her involvement in the 1993 group that she co-founded called Amamawu, named after this Dahomean goddess, was one of the few places where African and Caribbean women were involved in any significant degree. And this was actually the group that organised the protest with God giving birth in Bristol Cathedral, which, if you've seen the Instagram gallery where Joe read out that beautiful reading of how that protest went, if you haven't read it, if you haven't watched it, do check it out. So Black women were involved in this group and in Monika's network of friendships. But at the same time, I mean, there's a complex issue here, because although she had these kind of diverse friendships, I don't see much evidence in her work that she was involved in kind of her contemporary strains of anti-racist and Black feminist and women of colour politics that were happening at the same time. So in contrast to her, like, her individual friendships with Black women and in the networks of people who were interested in goddess spirituality and alternative spiritualities, you don't see much evidence in her writing that she was kind of engaged with Black feminist thinkers and politics that were kind of outside of these spaces, where there was also spiritual discourse happening. So it's kind of, in my view, interesting that she had these friendships and that she depicted Indian and African goddesses, yet at the same time, it seems to me that she was responding to ideas that came out of sort of theosophy and white esotericism. And she was still kind of participating in networks and movements which were dominated by white New Age ideas. And that's what she was responding to and opposing in her work. And here, so I've picked out two images. This one is Ishtar Inanna, which, as Sue explained, she painted in opposition, in a kind of protest of the Iraq War. And Ishtar Inanna is a Mesopotamian Sumerian goddess. And here we have the Indian or Tantric Kundalini serpent goddess. And if you notice, like, both of these goddesses from different Indian and Eastern contexts are transposed on Celtic landscapes, which I find really interesting. So Kundalini here is on Glastonbury Tor, and Ishtar Inanna is on, I don't know where that line came from, on sort of what looks like a prehistoric long barrow. There are lines appearing on my presentation. I don't know where they're coming from.
Oh, ah.
So on what looks like a prehistoric long barrow, like maybe Avebury, for instance. And she's interestingly, like, bringing these vastly different Indian, African, and Eastern figures all together under the sign of the Dark Mother and the Black Goddess. So there is a kind of, like, what I consider to be a homogenization going on of different cultural contexts and different Black and brown figures and deities from very, very different cultural contexts and different histories. And she brings them together under the sign of the Dark Mother and the Black Goddess, and what is a kind of romanticization of racial imagery. And I say romanticization because it's a kind of reversal of the kind of the evolutionary race science trope of light being progress and Blackness being primitive. But at the same time, it's not really, so I would say that it's not really a depiction that addresses Black and brown women in the kind of modern historical context of their or our own political struggles. There is a kind of romantic representation of prehistory associated with her image of Indian and African deities. And here I want to kind of go back to the God-giving birth painting, because, I mean, this is such an inspiring painting to so many of the women that I spoke to in the goddess movement. And in Monika's own words, she describes this painting as a painting of a woman who is not white and of more African than white. But I mean, when I first saw this painting, I mean, I was kind of surprised by this description because, I mean, if you look at it, it looks to me as a depiction of a white woman's body, but the face is kind of half Black, half white, and a bit mask-like. So my first question when I looked at this painting for the first time was, what is it about this painting that, for Monika, indicated that this was a woman of colour or of a woman who was Black or of African ancestry, when it appears to me to be kind of, you know, it's a complex image. There's different things going on here. And there's some of that romanticization, perhaps, that I was referring to earlier. And I think what she's doing is kind of, so this was a transgressive statement for its time. It was painted in 1968, and it was heavily censored because of its sort of depiction of raw sexuality and the female body and birth and sexuality and death and all of these things. But it's kind of drawing on the category of race or of darkness as a kind of, as the site of transgression, as the site of power and of opposition to patriarchy. So, I mean, this is also part of that kind of romanticization and possible objectification that I'm referring to. I mean, these are my interests in Monica, really, like her political spirituality, very long answer, sorry, Joe, and also her engagement with race and racism.
Yes, so thank you. Of course, very interesting. I'm going to ask you to answer my third question rather more briefly, so we've got plenty of time for question and answers, because we've got a lot of things coming up on the chat and a lot of very interesting observations. So, I mean, there's so much to say, isn't there? And hopefully another time we can have more. Lastly then, Monica's relevance today. Why is there this resurgence, thank goodness, at last, of interest in Monica?
I think Monica's work is very interesting. I think there is definitely a resurgence of interest in spirituality and witchcraft among younger feminist activists, but I'm not sure that the younger activists who are becoming interested in spirituality are necessarily aware of this longer history of the goddess movement. So it's interesting to kind of revisit Monica's work and reintroduce it, because I'm sure it will be of interest to many people. And I mean, in terms of like the points of relevance to contemporary discussions, I think there are so many things we can pick up on. And one of them is the role of figurative art. And I was thinking about the Mary Wollstonecraft statue, or the 4 Mary Wollstonecraft sculpture that's in Newington Green, and the debates about, you know, whether it's figurative or not, and is it feminist or not, or is it directed towards a white feminist gaze, or is it produced by a white feminist gaze? Who is it for? What does it represent? And you could say similar things about God giving birth. I mean, Monica thought that she was communicating clearly about women's empowerment and goddess religion, or prehistoric goddess religion, by depicting figures of female deities. And she saw abstract art as patriarchal. But I mean, I think there are multiple interpretations that could be at work, and it's not necessarily as clear-cut as she perhaps intended. The other point of relevance that I would like to pick up on is I think she would be very engaged in criticisms of New Age spirituality as transcending political and material struggle. Like the idea that we can create our own reality, and the idea of positive thinking and the law of attraction are actually more popular than ever. And if you think that Monica published New Age and Armageddon in 1992, those ideas have become so mainstream now and so popular. And I think she'd be very engaged in criticisms of like spiritual bypassing of political issues and an overemphasis on positivity. And also the role, I mean, the problems around appropriation and the representation of Black and brown women are still very much hot topics in spiritual spaces, I think.
Yes, yes. Well, there's a lot to think about there. And to give our participants a bit of time to do some of that thinking and posting questions, we're absolutely delighted to have Bethany Slim, who's a young performance artist who's was commissioned as part of a retrospective about Greenham Common to write a song and a poem. And because as a number of, all 3 of our speakers have mentioned, Monica was very active at Greenham. We're now going to, if Bethany would unmute herself, we're now going to hear from Bethany.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. So this piece, was written in that retrospective exhibition looking back at Greenham Common. It's called Where She Is Woman, and it includes protest songs sung at the camps. Have you ever seen pictures of bodies all burned, and imagine it's you and your family so hurt? We can't stop their madness, but we must do it now. So come down to Greenham, take a fence down at Greenham. We won't move from Greenham, 4 times running out. She isn't sure when it began, but there is a rock-like knot in the pit of her stomach that tells her she carries the power to change. It swells, It pulsates. She activates. Inside her home, she is giver, provider, carer, thus woman. She perseveres. She is tired. She perseveres. Outside, they tell her where she is woman, how to qualify as she, where she is allowed to climb to, what her body is for, what it is not for, where she can raise her voice and where that voice will be heard. She shouts as though through pillowcases, at headlines which assault her ethics, at broadcasts which fester in ears. She demands definitions for what she sees on the screens. Like, what do you mean national security? She stares through window panes at passers-by, as though from out there, they don't see what it is that she sees, that this is not the future for humanity, that we do not condone this here, that we do not agree. They don't ask. And the absence of consent is claustrophobic, and the walls of her home are at once closer and more fragile than they have ever been. So come down to Greenham, she hears it. Take a fence down at Greenham, she had already heard it. We won't move from Greenham, for time's running out. Collectivity is the energy which transforms the powerless. It ricochets through crowds in a joint gesture of defiance, says, we are counted, not listless, and history will list us. We respond, we resist, we occupy, we persist. And miles away, our pictures are passed through publics. They pose questions. They interrupt the daily routine, ask, what do you mean national security? They say, this does not have to be the norm. This is not normality. And sisters surround me, and we're dancing on the silos. And our feet tread thunder over ticking decisions as though our taps could reason with them through Morse code. Say, we don't speak your language, we use what we know. So come down to Greenham. And our chants interrupt the daily routine. They say this does not have to be the norm. This is not normality. Take a fence down at Greenham. That the future being written on behalf of us is not the future we have to see. We won't move from Greenham, for time's running out.
Lovely, thank you so much. And for the old folk amongst us who were at Greenham, that's really quite choking to listen to you singing that. Right, now we've got quite a lot of very interesting questions coming up. I hope I'm going to manage this successfully with the help of Amy Budd, one of our collective. A first question, which possibly Ruth, Sue, Kavita, you might all want to answer. And this was a question which was saying, what if the painting God Giving Birth really had been black? What if instead of looking white, it had definitely looked black? What do you think the reaction would have been then in terms of censorship and so forth? 10 times worse? That's a question to all three of you.
Well, actually, I answer that first. I mean, I think, yeah, I think it potentially would have been even more controversial, but I think it would have probably drawn the attention of anti-racist and civil rights activists, which I'm not really sure that it did. I can't find a lot of evidence that it did in 1968 when it was painted. So it probably would have drawn more censorship and also more criticism from different positions from a broader audience, I think.
Do you want to add anything, Ruth or Sue? Another question then.
Oh,
sorry, Sue.
I think it's really interesting that people were so upset by the obscenity and the blasphemy, I can say it right this time, that it was cutting across Christian religions and nations, and that it was obscene to show an actual vulva, you know, doing one of its jobs. And that was so antagonistic. I think the fact that the face was Africanized or whatever almost went unseen. It was an audience responding through the police and so on to particular sore points that they were just set off by. And I'm not sure whether it would make that much difference to that particular audience. An interesting point, but I'm not sure it would have made that much difference, to be honest. Interesting to think about, though.
Here's a question for you, Kavita. What should the goddess responses to the racial essentialism in Monika's work be? In other words, is it possible to redeem an anti-racist and decolonial goddess movement? Well, can you have a go at that for us?
I can. I mean, this is something that I focused on quite heavily in my thesis, and there's an article last year that was published last year that you might be interested in, whoever was asking that question, called Arachne's Voice, subtitled Race, Gender and the Goddess. And I think it's really important to understand these kind of racially essentialist representations in conjunction with the fact that the goddess movement still continues to be predominantly white in terms of its spaces and who's involved in it. And I think it's important to look at these things together and what effects this is having in terms of how people in the movement sometimes don't recognize the modern day struggles of Black and brown women. And it's the effects that these have, like the effects that these kinds of representations have, that is what interests me the most. So in a way, I'm less interested in the kind of attempts to reclaim ancient prehistoric cultures or even Indian and African deities, and I'm more interested in the kind of political effects on real people and how they are seen and understood. And I think the response should be one of careful criticism and looking at this issue more closely.
There's a question that I have missed there, a statement about an archive, which actually prompted me to say something. Monika, as all three of our speakers have mentioned, was enormously prolific. She wrote and wrote and wrote pamphlets, books, leaflets, and correspondence, letters. And I just want to mention there are actually 5 archives, and there's quite probably more. Kavita referred to the Women's Art Library at the Guildhall. There's a lot of archival material at the Feminist Library. The estate, Monika's grandchildren who've inherited her work, they have an archive. Maggie Parks, a very close friend, is holding an archive. In Sweden, I believe the Anna Norlander Gallery, am I right, Marianna, has an archive. And it wouldn't surprise me if somebody posts in a minute from North America that there's an archive there. So any of you potential researchers out there, there is so much material that needs to be looked at. Okay, there's a question. Oh, I've lost my questions. Could somebody talk a minute while I have a look? Oh, right, I found one. For all speakers, what about the goddess movement? What made it popular during Monika's time? Well, was it popular during Monika's time?
Yeah, I can maybe start having a go at that one. I think just the resurgence of interest in activism around feminism in the 1960s and 70s led to the reinvigoration of the goddess movement. There have been turns to like using matriarchal, like Judeo-Christian matriarchal culture in when feminism has come up in the past. So around the suffrage movement, you get questions about matriarchy and what the goddess can do for women's equality. So yeah, I think it just has to do with those questions being asked again, about women's equality. Yeah, and because you see, I would just say that you see that interest in matriarchy coming up in Britain and in the United States, as well, and they were linked. The British matriarchy movement was very much like linked to women's spirit in the US. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I've actually got a question for Marianna now. This is a message from Ted Overstall, who lives in Sweden. He says, do you know how much she is known in Sweden? Is it mostly in the US and in the UK? I live in Sweden, and even though I have an interest in both eco-feminism and anarchism, I've not heard of her. Is she not well known in Sweden? Now, I'll just say she will be by the time Marianna's finished, but can you answer that question for us, Marianna?
Yes, I can answer. I came to the conclusion that people who know about her are more like your generation. She was, there was a lot of exhibitions in the 70s and 60s and the 80s. And then she sort of disappeared, and she's not in the mind of everybody. Modern Museum has a couple of paintings of her, but that's about it. The big collection is at Anna Norlander Museum, not gallery, it's a museum.
Sorry.
And they have a lot of pictures, and Monica was very involved in the founding of that museum. So in Skellefteå, in the north of Sweden, there's a lot of her pictures to be able to see. And it's a big possibility we will be able to see them eventually in a big exhibition.
Yes, we have, and of course, Anna Norlander Museum, which is a small women's museum, has God giving birth. It's most interesting that this very small museum, which was probably, I'm not sure if I'm right, but was probably the first gallery to hold just women's paintings, that Monica chose to sell God Giving's Birth to them rather than to the big state gallery, which is typical, of course, of Monica, who wanting to support women's initiatives. And of course, women, but to say a little bit more, Ted, in answer to your question, she did tour. Her exhibitions toured Sweden, Norway, Finland. She toured a lot in Germany. I mean, she toured her exhibitions often, you know, in a very sort of ramshackle way, taking them herself, persuading somebody to drive a van and so on. She was determined to show as widely as she could. Right, any more questions to come up? How are we doing? We've got time for perhaps one more. I'm sorry, I'm not managing.
Sorry, Joe. Can I just interrupt? There was a really good question about the role of her story that I want to pick up on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And I think her story as a concept, I've still heard it used among goddess feminists, and it's quite a popular concept. So I mean, one of the anecdotes I can tell you about is in the late 80s, early 90s, there were some goddess feminists, including the artist Lydia Rule, who passed away several years ago, who were organizing goddess tours around Europe. And one of their intentions was to kind of reclaim goddess story through the concept of her story. So it was very, it's very important and popular in the goddess movement, and it's still present. But I also think that it's also always been slightly problematic, because like the history of women of color and Black feminist thought shows us that focusing on like the singular story of women's history and women's experience risks excluding women of color and Black women and different experiences. So taking patriarchy as like the singular horizon against which you narrativize a woman's story or her story, it kind of leads out a whole lot. And this is one of the central issues with the goddess movement, that it focuses on patriarchy in a kind of global universalizing sense to the exclusion of other forms and other structures of oppression.
Yes. Yes, I think one last one, which is because we need to be finishing and we've got a bit more we want to talk about. There's a question here about, does anyone have any information on the time Sjöö spent in Wales? I'll just flag up Rupert White's book, which you can get on Amazon. What's it called? I've forgotten its name, but by Rupert White about Monica.
Hi, my video's not working, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's on eBay as well, and it's called Monica Sjöö Life and Letters.
Lovely.
It's like a biography of Monica.
Yes, sorry, Rupert.
Thanks for the plug.
Well, it's got a lot about Monica's whole life, and actually one of the things that makes you exhausted to read was that she did travel so much. Anything that was going on, Monica was there with her posters and her paintings. But there's quite a lot about her life in Wales there. And we, as the collective, we are in touch with one or two of her close friends down in Wales, because Monica did a lot of spiritual journeys to Wales. Right, I think I'm going to have to stop the questions now. Thank you so much, Ruth, Kavita, Marianna, surprisingly having to chip in there, and Sue. Thank the four of you. And thank you all for your contributions, which have been really, really interesting and stimulating. So I just want to move on. What have I got to say now? Oh, yes. Before we go, I want to let you know that there's two very exciting Monica-related happenings. I said at the beginning that this was the first of many events we hope to do and hope to put on. And there's two exciting things happening in early spring. We've been working with Legion Projects, an artist-led organisation who in 2019 curated a touring exhibition, Waking the Witch, which featured quite a bit of Monica's work. And early next year, the artist Blue Firth, working with Legion Projects, will be releasing a podcast of interviews with her friends, admirers, art historians and academics, interweaving sound and music with interviews in her signature style. So that will be coming up in the spring. And also Legion will be launching a zine, a small print publication celebrating the life and work of Monica Sjöö. So please follow us on Instagram and check out the websites for those of you who don't use Instagram for the links to know when they're ready. And now Bethany is going to sing us out with one of Monica's favorite songs. And thank you all so much for coming today and joining us in celebrating the life of this remarkable woman. Oh, and this will be posted on Somerset Films' YouTube channel. Thank you very much to Somerset Film within the next day or two. So you'll be able to watch it again. So I'm Monica's words. Monica always signed her letters with these words, blessed be, and thank you for coming. Okay, Bethany?
She will take care of us, the earth is our mother. She will take care of us. Hey,